This is another discussion that I want to have, so I'm just going to make a video on it. So the discussion is that storytelling is universal, but the way we judge stories is not so much. For decades, if not centuries, story critique, especially in the mainstream, has been deeply rooted in Western literary traditions. Examples of this is like the three-act structure, the hero's journey, and the way that character arcs have been standardized and then become the standard to which all narratives are measured. And so the reason why I'm making this video is to question if perhaps this way of critique when it comes to stories is fundamentally flawed, because it might completely overlook how different cultures tell their stories in their own unique way. So I'll just make some examples of what I mean by the West. So in the West, storytelling, it has been deeply influenced by Aristotle's Poetics, which established the foundation for what many call good structure, essentially. Concepts like rising action, climax, and resolution dominate critiques. And then a little later, the Joseph Campbell's hero's journey became a model so pervasive in stories that it became the template for Star Wars all the way to The Lord of the Rings. So the differences that I'm going to be talking about in cultures is not arbitrary just because the name is different and it comes from Africa or East Asia or whatnot, but it's more fundamental. The reasons why are more fundamental. And to understand the differences, I'll just use the example from neuroscientist McGilchrist on the left and right hemispheres of the brain, where what you see in the left hemisphere is it's very analytical and focused on breaking things down into categories, structures, and patterns. This is the hemisphere that you would largely attribute to Western critique of in the way they basically look at things, measuring plot progression, consistency, narrative clarity, and execution. And of course, this is like a generalization on the West's part, because they haven't always been like this. So it's a historically recent. So that means like decades ago rather than hundreds of years ago. So it has been the case so far in recent history. Okay. So, but the right hemisphere, it thrives on context, ambiguity, and holistic experience. It values the feel of a story over its rigid structure. Many non-Western storytelling traditions lean more heavily on the right hemisphere, where you can see that they emphasize emotions, atmosphere, and spiritual meaning over logical progression. So some examples that I can make for other parts of the world and how they tell stories is, for example, the Kisho Tenketsu. It's Japanese narrative cycles. And oh yeah, I'll make a disclaimer, basically, to say that I'm not saying that the West or basically the rest of the world have fundamentally different ways of telling stories and they're irreconcilable. No, you will see that somebody from the West can view even the Kishoten Ketsu as rigid in its own way, even if it's supposed to be essentially taken in a much more right hemisphere approach. So back to Kishoten Ketsu. It's a 4-act structure that introduces an unexpected twist rather than direct confrontation. An example of this would be Spirited Away. It's a story that doesn't necessarily follow the hero's journey, but instead it unfolds through a series of experiences and transformations. In African oral traditions, many African stories are communal and meant to be performed rather than simply read. They focus on wisdom, community, and cyclical time. And an example of this would be the fact that West African folklore doesn't always conclude with a lesson, but rather presents an open-ended dialogue with the audience. And then you have the Indian epics as a third example, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, where you see that these stories are expansive, filled with divine interventions, moral dilemmas, and layered narratives that Western critique that I have seen usually labels them as messy and unfocused. And usually when you read those stories, you realize that that usually is the point, that they are not clean and well structured, but they are about cosmic and moral complexity. And so when you take these into consideration, you see that when Western critique becomes the standard, it doesn't just misunderstand global storytelling, but it devalues it. And this is not on purpose. This is something that I need to emphasize, that the West isn't some type of boogeyman bad guy who is purposefully going around and misjudging stories to make everyone else look stupid. That was the case way back in the colonial era, but right now that's usually not the case. And the only reason why it is like this right now was because of the work that happened back then, but also because the West are usually global powers and they release movies and media that everyone watches. And so everyone is used to their way of storytelling and actually starts to view it as the way to tell stories. So I would like to rather call it like a unforeseen consequence of their immense soft power. And I could also say that the funny thing is that I say Western, but a lot of Western aligned countries also don't have their own cultures represented. It's usually American and British, but there are still many others. So they are included in this rest of the world type of storytelling that we need to explore. Because when we do choose to explore other movies and media from other countries, and something I think that you have seen before, if you are a consumer of just media in general, when it comes to entertainment, is that we often see foreign films, and we'll just make an example of anime, is criticized for, like, for example, something random like pacing issues, when their structure isn't meant to be driven by tension and release. And how many times have you actually heard of Western reviewers always, not always, but sometimes complaining about a lack of character arcs in stories where transformation and growth isn't the focus of the story, but rather exploration and experience. And there's probably stories right now in the anime space that you've probably watched that you thought had a progression or character arcs that were meant to grow the character and take them to a specific destination and all these things, but in actuality they were simply exploring that character and their different aspects. And this is not something that the West is ignorant of, it's just that they have forgotten it over time, because we have examples of Western stories that do focus far more on how the story feels rather than the structure of it being a specific way. For now, from what I've seen, is that those types of stories are usually in music right now instead of in writing. I know that music is written and then performed, but you know what I mean, writing is in novels. And I would make an example of the post-mortem album of Mac Miller, Lunarism. I would say that's a great album that focuses on the feelings rather than the structure of what you would call a traditionally good rap album. And when we're talking about the West and like the hero's journey and the 3-act structure, is that what you would notice is that even if you just watch videos online in the anime space, is that in some ways you see that the West still tries to force their standards onto other cultures. And I don't mean this in a malicious way, I mean this in a way of that superficially, you could say, it's very obvious that the story does not fit the 3-act structure, it does not fit the hero's journey, it doesn't fit the things that they know of. But then you'll see them take like mental gymnastics, if you could say, to make it fit. So in the end, even if it breaks certain rules of, like, hardline rules of the 3-act structure or any of these Western techniques of understanding stories, they will still make it like vaguely similar. They'll make vague. The vagueness does not have to be like without grounding. It can have a lot of grounding, you know, like to the point you can say it's like theoretical. But in the end, it isn't actually a strict following of these 3-act structures or hero's journey or anything like that. But because they essentially make the concept of the 3-act structure, the hero's journey, and all these techniques so vague, they make them so vague and loose, then all of a sudden it starts fitting what the East is doing with its stories. All of a sudden it starts to fit. And it's like, it is the 3-act structure, it is the hero's journey. It's just that you have to look at it from a different perspective. And usually this is done to justify the quality of the story. Maybe not intentionally, but maybe it's subconsciously, to say that, the story does have the structures that we hold as the standard, so we should praise it for that. You know, it's just that it doesn't do it in the orthodox way that we know of it to be. And so I hope I'm making myself clear on that point. So if you're wondering, how do we fix this then? How do we improve our story critiques? The answer is just very boring. It's nothing revolutionary. It's just knowledge. It's about going to these societies and learning how they tell stories, how they receive the stories, so that we can have a better understanding as to what value looks like to them when it comes to their stories. Usually you'll see this when you see that there's a story that a lot of people in your community, when I say community, let's just say in the West, like in your community, that they don't like the story, but then you see in the East or wherever the story is from, a lot of people like it, then that means that there must be something different. There must be something that you just are not understanding about that story fundamentally. Or the story is just cussing out your culture and traditions, and so of course you don't like it, and your countries are enemies. So that's not to say that there's always going to be some deeply philosophical reason as to why you don't like the stories and on why they like the stories, and you just don't understand. Like, no, sometimes it's just something simple where it's like, no, this story, it's hating on my people. And I think the aspect that people don't want to happen, but is inevitable, is just accepting that certain stories are not going to be well liked across the world. So if it's a quality story in one culture, it doesn't mean that the West now has to consider it a good story for their audience. They can say, yes, that is a great story for the Japanese, for the East or Africa, that is a good story for them. But when the West is consuming the story, they say that, I just can't get into this, because you don't have the cultural background that will allow you to essentially get into it and enjoy it. It's great when you can learn these cultural backgrounds and you can actually enjoy the story. That is great, brings the world together, but it's not something to inherently feel bad about because you just couldn't enjoy a story, because you quite literally were not born to enjoy it, if you could say that. So in the end, this is about what I said in the beginning. This is more about story critique. It's about not saying like essentially that the story from this other country is objectively bad, but it's just to put context and to say that, oh, it's not that good in our context, and they should do the same if they're consuming Western stories and they don't like them for story structure reasons. We should always strive to judge these stories in their context, and then we can also judge it in our own context. Well, with that, that's the end of the video.